It is precisely the isolationist policy of the United States, specifically under Donald Trump, that could very well become a real starting point for World War III.
And does he possess the capability to launch a full-scale ground operation? And in general, what is the underlying purpose of all this escalation?
It's a significant and major distraction from what the United States really wants to do, including under the current presidential administration. However, people just listened to and heard something a bit different, specifically what was being said much more loudly.
In the debut episode of our podcast, we discussed the situation that is unfolding in the world. At the moment, after the Munich Security Conference, after Trump's threats to Iran, Greenland, Cuba, and other countries, we will talk about what is really happening in the world with our expert guest.
Our guest in the studio is a former student of the Academy of Foreign Intelligence, known as the Andropov Red Banner Institute, the elite training institute of the Soviet Union's intelligence service. During his government service, he participated in the planning and execution of special operations. After leaving government service, he relocated to the East and now works with private corporations, specializing in the collection and analysis of sensitive intelligence, as well as providing strategic security for business operations in high-risk and conflict regions.
You are a specialist who can surely read between the lines and see more than others, more than I do. I see what's happening in the world from daily headlines and from detailed articles in major international publications, Reuters, Bloomberg, the BBC, and so on, but given your extensive professional experience, you are probably quite used to not simply believing everything that the mainstream media writes, but rather focusing on what is actually happening on the ground. You surely have access to specific information that tells you a bit more than what we typically see, a vast network of personal contacts and so on. Let's not delve into that, but instead discuss what is actually happening in the world right now. Trump, America, are they still the center of power or not anymore? What does Trump really want, and does he want it personally, or is it someone else's desire? Is it the United States of America that wants this? I don't even know where to start. Maybe you could set the tone for our conversation. In your opinion, what is the most recent thing that is worrying the world right now?
Without a single shred of doubt, in my personal estimation, the singular and arguably the most deeply alarming and pressing issue for the entire global community today is the looming threat of a devastating global war, a total global armed conflict, everyone fighting against everyone else, or let's say one massive coalition pitted against another powerful coalition. We are witnessing a world where former alliances are falling apart right before our eyes like a sandcastle. We have not yet witnessed the formation of new alliances, but that may be ahead of us. And from my perspective, the whole complex situation right now, given this deep-seated anxiety shared by people all across the entire world about what exactly will happen next and whether this truly terrible event we call a world war will actually occur. This is my personal perspective on this very complex matter. Currently, a wide range of seasoned political experts and prominent international journalists are actively discussing the strategic efforts of the 47th U.S. President's administration. These diplomatic actions are supposedly aimed at preventing the outbreak of World War III and achieving, let's call it, some kind of lasting and stable peace between an aggressive Russia and the nation of Ukraine. All of this is being done under the explicit and public pretext of preventing a catastrophic Third World War that many observers fear could eventually arise from the continued escalation of this specific regional conflict. So, from my point of view, it is precisely the isolationist policy of the United States, specifically Donald Trump and his activity, exclusively destructive activity, in matters of relations with allies and partners, as well as all his various actions that are supposedly covered by efforts to achieve peace between Russia and Ukraine, a so-called just peace. In reality, these specific actions could very well become the true starting point of a potential World War III. This is a deeply concerning and dangerous development for the entire international community and the future of global stability. And it's not just about Russia and Ukraine right now.
We'll talk about this now. To examine this in greater detail, but I want to add a few important introductory remarks first. You say that Trump's efforts are fundamentally destructive, but at the same time, the US president and his supporters claim that he ended either 8 or 9 wars and wants to see peace throughout the entire world. And now you're saying that he could push the world toward World War III.
It is certainly true that such opinions exist, and you can often hear them being expressed by a wide range of experts, analysts, and influential opinion leaders. I can certainly appreciate and understand the logic behind this point of view. However, I personally see something quite different in Trump's recent actions. I don't want to delve into discussing the long list of so-called pseudo-wars and conflicts that Trump supposedly ended. First of all, he didn't start any wars in the first place to be able to end them. So, I would suggest that we set that aside for the time being. Instead, I'd like to focus your full attention on this fundamental question. What is the true meaning of peace? Let's answer that question. What does it really mean to bring a war to an end? Well, if you think about it, there are actually only 2 main ways that a war can truly end. The first scenario occurs when one side completely defeats the other, and the defeated party formally acknowledges its loss. The second scenario happens when both sides are so thoroughly exhausted, both economically and in terms of their overall military potential, that they are simply unable to continue pursuing their own strategic initiatives, especially offensive ones, as well as defensive operations, and so on. This creates a situation very similar to what we see today, for example, between North and South Korea. Once again, I have no idea which wars Trump is talking about. However, when we consider the specifics of what Trump actually means by his statement that he achieved peace, from my own personal perspective, it is quite difficult to fully agree with that assessment. Because if what you achieve is not a true and lasting peace, but, let's say, a mere temporary lull in hostilities, a brief pause at the heavy cost of introducing deep conflict into the very environment of your closest allies, essentially undermining and destroying long-standing established ties, norms, rules, and international procedures. If you achieve a simple truce by offering a bribe to the aggrieved victim so that the victim does not declare, for example, that they are a victim of clear aggression and is instead content with the current situation, then it becomes fundamentally and practically impossible to call that state of affairs a genuine peace. I would call this a critical and decisive breaking point, where a future conflict is highly probable to occur, only of much more devastating and significant intensity, because the underlying problems have not been satisfactorily addressed or resolved. Neither side, for example, has yet admitted a total defeat. Neither side has lost its deep-seated desire or its long-standing claims to the disputed territory or to any other specific objectives for which it first started and employed such powerful tools as organized armed forces and such a destructive method as open war. This is because we all clearly understand that war is merely a different way of continuing politics, which is to say, it is a means of pursuing various national ambitions. It's just a method, a means. Wars don't start for no reason.
Before we continue, I'd like to offer a brief disclaimer. By this point in our discussion, many viewers might already have developed a persistent and classic feeling that we are acting in someone else's specific interests, that this entire podcast is either strictly for Trump or strongly against Trump, or perhaps something else entirely, about something or someone. In reality, we are the independent platform NEXTA, and we work in the interests of, to all of you, our wonderful viewers. If you are enjoying this video, please give us a big thumbs up and support our work financially if you are able to do so that we can continue having these very interesting conversations with many different people who possess a vast wealth of information that may not often appear in the traditional mainstream media outlets. We thank you so much for your continued support. That was just a brief digression. A note for the viewers. Still returning to a more current, pressing, detailed and specific agenda, namely the latest information that is appearing more and more often in the media, there is this escalation regarding... First it was Greenland, then Venezuela, and finally Cuba. Now it seems that Iran is the main topic on the agenda. Are all these events connected to each other? In your own view, an objective, independent opinion, who stands to benefit from this? Trump? Duh. And still, is he truly capable of launching a full-scale ground operation? And in general, what is the purpose of all this escalation in the world? After all, wars can be ended without threatening everyone with tariffs, without saying one thing today and another tomorrow. Perhaps this is some kind of tactic by the President of the United States, with all due respect. He was democratically elected by the majority, albeit by a small margin, of the American people. And still, what is the reason Trump is doing what he is doing in the world right now?
It's a fairly complicated question because I do not claim to read the mind of the 47th President of the United States, fortunately, and I am certainly not a particularly close personal friend or a political ally. I cannot help but say that I really doubt he has any truly close friends at all, or anyone in his entire circle who could actually be described in such a way. Simultaneously, and as I repeat, the question is extraordinarily intricate, and in order to provide a truly comprehensive and thorough explanation, I am afraid my speech could extend for a considerably long period of time, and might even begin to tire the viewer. So I would start with a more straightforward portion of your question, specifically focusing on whether we should expect a ground operation or, more broadly, a full-scale military invasion of Iran by the United States at all. Speaking from my own personal perspective, I am extremely doubtful about this situation and firmly believe that the actual likelihood of a full-scale U.S. ground operation taking place in Iran is practically zero in the current climate. But why? First of all, the United States of America is not prepared for such an operation, and even if a second naval fleet is sent there, these forces are still completely insufficient to, let's say, achieve success in a major ground operation. We should not underestimate the armed forces of Iran and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Iran possesses a rather large and significant arsenal of firepower, including drones, a navy, and an air force. Perhaps not the most advanced in the world, but it does indeed have one. But most importantly, the rise of unmanned drones. We have all witnessed how, for example, Ukrainian Sea Baby drones and others are successfully sinking massive enemy ships in the Black Sea, one could say the flagships of fleets. And
Russia is using Iranian Shahed drones against Ukraine.
yes, we should also not forget that these Shaheds have long been modified. That is the experience. Both sides are learning from the actual combat use, and now we see that the Shaheds are already flying equipped with powerful jet propulsion. We see that the combat and technical capabilities of the Shaheds have increased. Undoubtedly, I am more than certain that the Russian side, as we might put it, is actively providing very detailed feedback to its Iranian partners, and Iran is perfectly well aware of this situation. And of course, it is quite clear that I would personally assume that it has implemented the same advanced technical solutions, and if it hasn't quite yet, then it has already begun to actively implement them in the production or modification of its own specialized offensive strike drones. That is essentially it. Now, for the second point, the second key point is the role of society. And this is a crucial and highly significant point to consider, specifically how Iranian society would perceive the potential invasion of foreign troops. We were all witnesses, so to speak, to the recent conflict, a relatively short-term conflict between Iran and Israel just recently. This engagement mainly consisted of heavy missile and bomb strikes, long-range ballistic missile attacks, precision cruise missile strikes, swarms of drone attacks, and so on. It is worth noting that you should pay close attention to the fact that, on the contrary, the general population of Iran actually became much more united. Let's say if they didn't become more united in a formal sense, then at least they remained neutral, and overall, from a broader perspective, there were many documented instances when they were deeply offended and visibly outraged by the nature of the Israeli attacks. Even though it would seem at that moment the regime was very vulnerable and weakened. But this did not actually bring people out onto the streets, nor did it prompt a significant number of protest armed groups, including those operating in certain regions of Iran, to launch any attacks that were coordinated against key state nodes and important facilities. No, it did not. I believe that the same could be expected for American troops in the event of an invasion of Iran. The fact is that for many Iranians, a US soldier is the same as an Israeli soldier, And my personal opinion is that the current protests in Iran were triggered by somewhat different factors. In other words, the root of the problems lies elsewhere, as they say in Daily Bread. That is to say, it was entirely and exclusively economic problems and harsh economic realities that provoked and pushed the people of Iran to rise up and protest, to make their voices heard and make demands, including for the overthrow of the Ayatollah's regime and so on. That's if we're talking about the population of Iran. I'm not an expert on the Middle East, and I would be glad if any of our viewers who are specialists in this field would share their thoughts and correct me. I would be very grateful. Secondly, that's if we've only talked about Iran. Now let's talk about the USA to launch an armed invasion. The fact is, according to US law, this operation must be approved by the US Congress. You might counter by saying, well, that didn't stop Donald Trump, for example, from carrying out the so-called unique operation to allegedly kidnap Nicolas Maduro. We're not actively discussing those events right now, but I just want to strongly emphasize that that operation was of a police nature, which essentially means that Trump found a loophole to successfully carry it out, and Congress really wasn't notified, nor were many others. However, Trump did carry it out, but it was conducted as part of a police mission. That is, Maduro had been indicted in absentia by a US court, and there was a special legal case underway. Thus, in this case, the US armed forces were carrying out a police mission, so to speak. I would like to bring your direct attention to the fact that this police mission, according to various reputable and well-known media outlets, cost former President Trump an estimated staggering total of $3 billion. This included the deployment of the fleet and other assets in the Caribbean basin, and moreover, during the peak period. If my memory serves me correctly, during the months of November through to January, every single day that the entire fleet remained stationed in that location, it cost the American taxpayers $20 million. So it was quite an expensive special police operation.
And at the same time, Trump says that he is cutting spending, that he is withdrawing from the World Health Organization, that he is reducing the State Department's spending on various support programs and so on. In other words, it's actually taxpayers' money. Ultimately, depending on the need, it can still be used.
In my personal opinion, and based strictly on the information I currently have available, which includes data from open and verified sources, Trump generously, or shall we say, quite freely and without holding back, spends the hard-earned money of American taxpayers on, let's put it this way, effectively solving his own personal and legal issues, including patching up gaps in his image, in image failures, as well as on various adventures. As for his own personal money, I'm afraid he wouldn't spend a single cent on this himself. But increasing his own income at the expense of the American budget, yes, that he would do. But there, in principle, he never hid this intention, and to be fair, even during his election campaign. It's just that people heard something a bit different, what was said louder. But in fact, this desire, Trump never hid it and believed it was his right. However, let's return to the situation with Iran. So we have a significant second issue to consider. This operation must be officially authorized and approved by Congress. If we still proceed from the assumption that, despite all of Trump's destructive actions towards his own country, this country still continues to strictly follow its own constitution.
And the system of checks and balances.
If it works, of course. Thus, we arrive at the point that Congress must approve this. However, let's take a look at what's happening in the US itself. Despite Trump's fiery public assurances and his gratitude to himself, which is what he arguably does best, America is now facing very serious problems. Huge problems, including financial ones and in the social sphere as well. Healthcare. Among other things, the question still remains. I haven't checked, to be honest. The latest news? How was the situation with the Department of Homeland Security resolved, regarding which the government was conducting a shutdown? Current migration issues and challenges are intrinsically connected and tied, let's say, with the actions of such federal agencies as Immigration and Customs Enforcement, as well as the various operations of the Department of Homeland Security, and so on. In other words, social issues. There are major social issues.
And Trump himself has his own problems. His approval rating is suffering because of all this.
Because of this too, undoubtedly. The same file, the Epstein file, and so on. So, in fact, the internal problems in America are deeper and greater than ever before. And against this backdrop, and yet, a number of financial analysts believe that the financial situation in the US has not improved at all, as Trump claims. On the contrary.
High prices I see as well. In Greenland, 25% approval. I just saw that Trump's latest approval ratings dropped to his second-term minimum, around 36 to 40% by mid-February. At the moment, in the United States. The problems we're talking about are documented, and again, regarding Greenland, only 25% approval. Well, returning to the context of our conversation...
Well, if you don't mind, I'd like to finish talking about the elections, just to be more concise and wrap this up. Because, as I said at the beginning, your question is very broad and involves a lot of aspects. Unfortunately, it's hard to answer in just one or two sentences, or at least to express the idea clearly. Now let's take a look at the US allies, namely first and foremost the NATO bloc. After all, I think it's obvious to any expert that, in principle, conducting a ground operation alone, especially in such terrain and other conditions as Iran presents, taking into account its neighbors, where things are also very unstable, is extremely difficult. We know that nearby there are Pakistan, Iraq, Afghanistan, Azerbaijan, and so on.
Turkey's position as well.
Turkey. We'll talk more about the neighbors in a moment, but nevertheless, right now, we're talking about allies. It's obvious that such an operation would require cooperation, that is, additional efforts and assistance from other alliance countries. And in principle, we've already seen this. It happened in Iraq, it happened in Afghanistan. And by the way, when Trump brings up the cornerstone issue and accuses Europe of, and regarding other NATO allies, not just the European ones, in that they supposedly cost the American taxpayer a great deal of money, he conveniently omits the fact that in all the years of NATO's existence, Article 5 has only ever been invoked once, and it was the United States that requested its activation after the events of September 11th. So, as they say, the situation on the ground is completely different from what's in Trump's head. Therefore, I believe that such a ground operation could actually lead to the need, in order to carry it out successfully, to actively engage with and seek assistance from other allies within the alliance. But all of Trump's recent efforts and statements have led directly to the current state of affairs we see now, and what we heard, including at the Munich Security Conference. Yes, NATO still exists, but it exists mostly just on paper rather than as a functional force. We are currently witnessing what could be perhaps either a deep restructuring of NATO or essentially the United States of America completely withdrawing from this organization. This is a very real possibility. That is to say, we will see either a deep restructuring or something entirely new will emerge. Nevertheless, I am certainly far from entertaining the notion that if America now decides to launch an invasion and commences a full-scale ground operation in Iran, all the more so since this is a very explosive region with numerous risks. It is not necessarily because of the war itself, but rather because of its far-reaching consequences and aftermath. I am far from thinking that after Trump's recent statements and the specific actions of his administration, any of the NATO partners would ever want to become actively entangled in this dubious adventure. This is also considering that many people currently living in these countries are not only from Iran, but also from Afghanistan, Pakistan, and various other neighboring regions. So we have a problem. America has a problem with its allies, a problem of trust and cooperation.
If not NATO, then surely they have a non-NATO ally, Israel.
I understand, yes. You just took the very words right out of my mouth, as the old saying goes. Yes, there is the state of Israel, but then again, Is Israel ready? Ready to participate in a ground operation? Undoubtedly, the actions of the US will, in one way or another, be coordinated with Israel, just as Israel coordinates its actions of this nature, if we're talking about the military aspect, with the United States of America. However, Israel's capabilities to support the US in a full-scale invasion
Are limited?
They are limited, undoubtedly. And let's not forget about the Iranian proxies. If a full-scale invasion begins and Israel takes part in it, allocating forces and resources, I believe we should expect attacks along the entire perimeter of Israel's borders, from Iranian proxies, from Hamas, which is still operating successfully, despite once again Trump's loud statements, Hezbollah and so on. What should be done about this? That is, and other radical Islamic groups as well. Second, Israel and the United States. Recently, there was a meeting between Benjamin Netanyahu and Trump. A number of journalists, several major publications, write that overall the meeting was fruitless. In other words, both sides stuck to their positions. Yes, as they say, with the cards in their hands. And I think that the main purpose of the meeting was actually, first and foremost, to synchronize the intentions of Israel and the USA regarding Iran, because it is important for Israel to understand what America really intends to do, since this will directly affect Israel. Does Trump just want to carry out symbolic strikes again and then leave?
And Israel must deal with it now.
Israel has to live with it, yes. Or Trump wants something more. Again, a ground operation. Even though Israel openly declares that the Ayatollah regime is a major threat to the state of Israel, remains a complex issue. And Israel will not stop until not only Iran removes all its nuclear production from the country and so on, but also as long as the Ayatollah regime remains in Iran. This is Israel's official position. At the same time, I would also like to draw your attention to the specific fact that quite recently, when Donald Trump was asked by his own group of journalists, his own press pool, the following question, "Mr. President," it went, "is the ultimate goal of our troops' presence and these possible military strikes, this pressure on Iran, is it actually regime change or something else entirely?" Trump replied that if the Ayatollah regime makes, as he always says, a truly wonderful deal with him, then he has no intention of changing any regimes at all. In other words, this is about something completely different. It's absolutely not about regime change or helping some society, or as it used to be so nicely disguised before, at least not behind the usual phrases about developing democracy and freedoms. No. Trump says it openly, and I think it's not even about Iran. In my personal opinion, I believe that the core issue is deeply tied to various complex financial matters and economic concerns, any specific issues that, in one way or another, let's say, are directly correlated with finances, with potential opportunities for personal enrichment, for gaining something of value, and so on. And ultimately, that is what truly comes first and foremost in this situation. Look at Venezuela. Let's, for a moment, shift a bit to another continent, to a different example. Trump, he arrested Maduro, but did anything actually happen? Were there any fundamental changes in Venezuela itself? Did the government change? No.
Only oil now. The money for oil is probably coming from the US.
I think we'll discuss this in our next conversation. This oil is still a big question. Who is the consumer? First of all, it's heavy oil, and not every country needs it. Because you need to have specific production facilities, special technologies for processing this oil. It's a labor-intensive process. In
the next episode, we will definitely discuss this. Subscribe to the channel.
That's why I believe that, in fact, overall, even the actions of the American fleet in Hormuz, let's say near Iran, the deployment of US flotillas, these constant statements like, "I'm moving the fleet here, I'm moving the fleet there."
It's been 2 weeks already. In
my opinion, there's something completely different behind this than what is being declared. And in general, this specific manner of Trump, this tactic, it's like a cheap theatrical show on the boulevard. The louder, the flashier, the better it is. That's what the unsophisticated audience reacts to and spends their last cent on.
Just like they paid for the book The Art of the Deal.
Yes, that is why I see a hidden motive behind all of this. It is just a distraction from the truth. A major distraction from what the United States really wants to do, including through this current administration. From their real intentions. Everything else is just noise, whether informational or even, you could say, an entire fleet, because if they succeed, the benefits will outweigh the costs of having that fleet there. That's why I think here there is something entirely different at the core, so to speak, rather than just a change of someone, Maduro, the fight against certain drug cartels and so on.
And in the next episode, we will try to dig deeper, to find the bottom on which everything is moving and which remains hidden from the public eye. Kilometers down. And in conclusion of our first episode, of course, I want to thank you, dear viewers, and our guest. Based on the evidence, we have reached the conclusion that a full-scale ground invasion of Iran is unlikely at this point, judging by the established facts. However, it is important to remember that numerous geopolitical experts said that Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which we will also discuss in our next episode, was considered unlikely before the invasion began in 2022. And in conclusion, I want to show you a video about what we have been discussing, how Iran and other countries are adapting to modern warfare. A foreign operation today may be one thing, and a month later it could be a completely different operation. It will be with the development of artificial intelligence and modern technologies. For example, Shahids in Ukraine have started carrying 2 FPV drones on board in order to increase the impact of their strikes. We are also seeing drones using fiber optic connections. And in the next episode, we will definitely discuss this with an expert, the details of such operations, what lies beneath the headlines. Thank you very much. Maybe you have a lyrical digression at the end for our viewers.
Nothing lyrical. The most important thing is that I sincerely wish everyone a life filled with safety and security under peaceful and clear skies. And once again, I truly want to reiterate and emphasize this crucial point. As the old saying goes, the devil is always found in the details, and sometimes the one who proclaims loudly about wanting peace is exactly the one who opens up the gates to hell and to war.
And we will discuss this in the second episode.